All right, guys. Nice to have you here. We're in the Sermon on the Mount still, and so as the last session, I'm not really comfortable with where I'm leaving things, and I don't have a great wrap up for our time together today. We're just going to continue where we left off and see where we can get to. And we were leaving off last week in this third triad. We'll review just a little bit where we've come from and maybe look to where we're going. But as we think about these things, it's going to be important for us to have an understanding of what Jesus is trying to accomplish. And in this first triad, we've seen that he's talking about human dignity. Human dignity. Now, at the same time, we've been talking about what? Sex and violence, quite a bit. Jesus had a lot to say about these things. And in terms of developing the human heart to become what a fit kingdom citizen is. And so as we delve into these principles of the heart, Jesus is dealing very frankly with these subjects, and to be quite honest about it, we've all been a little bit uncomfortable talking about these things. As we're trying to excise the world and worldliness from our hearts, it becomes uncomfortable to admit where we stand and the distance that we need to travel to become fit kingdom citizens. But that's what the Sermon on the Mount is about. As Jesus is describing how righteousness is being fulfilled, how understanding of the deep principles of the Torah need to be explored and understood with a deeper sense of meaning. Before we get into our class today, though, I did want to provide that one more opportunity for you to bring to light the assignment where we were talking about that kind of framing as Jesus did. You have heard it said, and I say unto you. And dealing with some modern issues that we sometimes don't have a full grasp of what these things should be. And so does anybody have anything that they would like to share? Last opportunity, last call for you to bring forward your ideas about you have heard it said, and I say unto you. All right, I guess Bonnie has one that she would like to share today.
You've heard it said, go to church. But I say to you, be the church.
I like that one. I like that one. So, last week, Bonnie had something to say about the church. And she said at that time, don't assume that if you surround yourself with the functions of the church, that you've accomplished everything that Christ wants you to be. I don't know if I summarized that very well or not. But that's what. But now she's giving us the flip side of the coin, and saying, understand your identity as a member of the church is not just a facet of life, but it is a description of your identity in this particular community, in this family. And I like that. So thank you very much for that. All right, then we will press on. So remember, we've entitled this class the Revolutionary Kingdom Declarations, because Jesus is focused on the kingdom here. And we're using this iceberg as a metaphor to help us understand that, and as Jesus is describing this, what you see on the surface isn't the totality of what is there. We need to dive deeper. We need to be able to see what is beneath the surface. And when it comes to an iceberg, we know that there is a lot more under the surface than there is above the surface. So that's a great metaphor to describe Jesus' teaching about the law and how deep we need to get in coming to understand these principles. We started with the Beatitudes, the blessed are the poor, those that mourn, the gentle, the hungry, and those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, the persecuted, the slandered, to describe that Jesus was welcoming the common people of his day, and was kind of turning the world upside down in terms of the understanding of what it means to be a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. And the fact that it was those that were considered to be quite lowly in their society who were welcomed into the kingdom. And in fact, they needed to have that demeanor of humility to come, to be shaped in their hearts to what Jesus would have us be. And then he talked about the fact that we need to be salt, we need to be light, and this city set on a hill, shining with our good works and understanding the covenant, the eternal covenant that we have with God in terms of understanding our place in the kingdom. And we've come to the first part of the sermon itself, the body of the sermon, where Jesus is describing the fact that he did not come to abolish the Torah, the law, but he's come to fulfill. And he begins with these, what we're calling these case studies, and describing these things of how to understand the law. When you read the Ten Commandments and you read, don't murder, don't commit adultery, really, what does that mean? And Jesus gets to the heart of those issues as we begin talking about those. And it's very obvious that Jesus is in great conflict to the religious thinking of the day, primarily among the Pharisees. We said that Jesus resembled the Pharisees in many ways. He was very conservative in terms of looking at the law and granting the law its due authority. But the Pharisees had this unhealthy obsession with the legalities of the law and the outside appearance of what it means to be keeping the law. And they didn't spend as much time cultivating the necessary heart. And so what we find here in this sermon is that Jesus is really beginning to deal with the heart of these issues. And so we've come to this first triad. You've heard it said, don't commit murder. But he says, you need to eliminate murderous rage as well, the contemptuous insults, and even lesser insults. Understand, human dignity is to be respected. Human life is sacred because God has placed his image upon every human being. And when we disregard that with arrogance, then that places us in a position of judgment ourselves. And so that Jesus made quite a dramatic statement with that, and we've spent a little bit of time talking about that. And then we went to the second one, the idea of adultery, and we said, really, it's the same kind of concept. When a man looks upon a woman and objectifies her, it is arrogance proceeding from his heart again, saying, I can take what is not mine, I can make that the object of my fantasy even, without even touching the woman. And Jesus said, it is the heart of the matter that we're concerned about. And so Jesus makes it very clear that when the law said do not commit adultery, there's much more beneath the surface that needs to be explored. Again, we need to get to the heart of the matter. And we left off last week just introducing this third triad about divorce. Verse 31 and 32 of Matthew 5 says, and it was said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of dismissal. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the cause of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And so we said last week that Jesus isn't timid at all about wading into some very controversial waters here. And that is what he is doing. This was a controversial matter in the first century. And what the rabbis and the teachers of the law were doing, they were going back to Deuteronomy 24, as we read last week, and they're making their observations about that, where Moses gives this instruction about when you send your wife away, here is how this is to be done. And we read that, and we were a little bit bewildered about the vagueness of that. And the vagueness of that is why there was this controversy surrounding it. So if you go back to the time of Moses in the wilderness, when this law was given, divorce was rampant. Remember, these were people who just came out of the idolatry of Egypt. They didn't have respect for the covenant of marriage. And so, as you can imagine, the stresses of living in the wilderness with husbands and wives and all of the changes taking place, you can imagine that was quite a time of disunity and disharmony in marriages. And so you can imagine that right and left men were sending their wives away. I don't want to have any, you're a curse to me. I'm sending you away. I found somebody else. And that was indeed the case. And so this provision, or concession, some would say, was given by Moses to slow that down, to kind of cap that. And this is really the only thing in the entire Torah of 613 laws that says anything about divorcing your wife. And there's not a whole lot there for us to latch on to. And so that controversy was raging in Jesus' day among the rabbis. And there were primarily two major schools of thought. One of those was from the school of Hillel. And that school was that a man may divorce his wife for any reason. And when he does so, he gives her a certificate. And basically, that certificate would say, you can go and marry whoever you want now. Our covenant is over. And that's how they carried on. And this was the prevailing opinion of Jesus' day. Now, we've made the observation before that this was a very male-centric culture. So it's interesting to me that here in two of these first three case studies, Jesus is dealing with issues involving women. That's something that we should not look at lightly. Jesus is elevating the importance of women in this society who were largely an afterthought. If you were to ask a first century man, what is the definition of adultery? A first century Jewish man, that man would probably something like, adultery is a violation against a married man. That was the concept. And the idea was, women, they're not concerned about adultery. They have no say in this matter. To such a point that women were not even permitted to divorce their husbands. Only men could initiate a divorce in this society. And they could do this with the prevailing opinion for any cause, for any reason. Now, let's just stop and think about what that sets up in a culture. Women have no power over this situation. Only men can initiate a divorce, and men can do this for any reason. Also add to that women in this culture would be quite dependent upon their husbands for their livelihood. It's an understanding, pretty much an assumed position that when a woman leaves a husband, she's going to have to find another man in order to be able to eat and live. That is the assumption that Jesus is working with even in this short 2 verses. Because what does he say? In verse 32, I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife, except for the cause of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. She doesn't have any option. She's going to have to attach herself to another man by which she will be able to navigate life. That's the culture that we're dealing with. And so if only the man can initiate a divorce, and he can do that for any reason at all, that places women in a very vulnerable position and sets up all kinds of toxic relationship issues that could be exploited by men. And do you think that didn't happen? You would be wrong. You would be wrong. Men can be very inhumane. Women can too. But if you place all of the power in what should be a co-equal relationship, and you place all of the power in one party, can arrogance result from that? Can failure to recognize this co-partner as having the image of God enter into that? Can I get an image where I don't recognize the sacredness of this? Of course. Of course. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that Jesus would come to the aid of the woman who's in this vulnerable position and say, men, stop it. Regard your partner as a co-equal member of the marriage. Regard your partner with a sacred understanding that this is a person who bears the image of God as well. And you don't treat an image bearer in that way. You see how all of these concepts in this first triad are related? The arrogance of one to mistreat another. It all comes full circle again. And I say that doesn't surprise me that Jesus took that position, because this is something we find consistent with what Jesus does. When Jesus is dealing with people of different statuses or inequities of power, where does Jesus give priority?
To the underdog.
Always the underdog.
Always. Always the underdog. You're right. Give me an example of that.
The widow and her two mites.
She gave more than anybody. See how he has elevated her status? She's a nothing. She's a nobody. She doesn't have any money to contribute. Jesus elevates her. Give me another example.
The man praying opposed to the Pharisees praying out loud.
The two, the tax collector and the Pharisee praying. I'm glad I'm not like these other sinners. The Pharisee prayed. I fast and I tithe, and God, you must be so proud of me. And the tax collector said what? God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And who went down to their house justified that day? Jesus prioritizes the one with the lower status. In Matthew the 11th chapter, we find Jesus being referred to as the friend of tax collectors and sinners. When Jesus approaches a woman at a well in Samaria, and we could make some remarks about her, right? This was probably a common situation. She's been married multiple times. I've read that text many times and thought, well, she's kind of a loose woman then, isn't she? But when you understand the culture, it isn't all about her sexual impropriety. She could have been widowed a number of times. That was quite common in these days. But she could have been cast away a number of times as well because of the society in which she lived, in which women were not valued and men had all of the power. Could be. So I look at her a little bit differently now. And Jesus selects this woman to make his announcement to the world that he is the Messiah. That had been a closely guarded secret among the disciples up until this point, and Jesus selects not only a woman, but a woman living in sin who is a Samaritan, the chief of the underdogs. How about the woman who was caught in adultery and brought to Jesus? How did he treat her? He elevated her. Does nobody stand here to condemn you? Then I don't judge you either. Go and sin no more. Jesus is the friend of those of low status. Even in Matthew 19, which we probably need to go there, we're going to talk about a longer context of him discussing divorce. The very next thing he talks about in that chapter are children. And in this society, children were loved, but they're last in line. They were not considered as important like we think about children today. And so the children are coming in, occupying Jesus' time, and his disciples are saying, get these crummy kids out of here, right? And Jesus says, let the children come to me. The lower status is given priority and is elevated. This is who Jesus is. And he does this consistently, over and over and over again. So the culture sets up this, this toxic potential of domineering men who are going to, or are going to have this issue of being tempted to be domineering men, I should say. And so Jesus protects vulnerable women. I want you to notice another word here in verse 32. I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife except for the cause of unchastity, look at this phrase, makes her commit adultery. It makes her commit adultery. Now I said that this speaks to the culture of the day because a divorced woman cannot remain on her own and single, most likely. They're very dependent in this culture. Does anybody have the NIV?
I do.
Will you read that? Will you read that phrase to me?
But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery.
Kelly, do you have a different rendering there of
Yeah,
NIV?
mine says makes her the victim of adultery.
So that's an updated version of the NIV. Makes her a victim of adultery. That places a whole different thought around that. And there are grammatical reasons why the translators of the NIV selected that. Because it's in a passive voice. She has no say in this matter at all. She has been divorced for any cause. She's required to live, to attach herself to another husband. She doesn't want this. She has been victimized by this. And so Jesus turns to the powerful man in the situation and says, not only are you wrong to divorce her, you're responsible for the adultery that ensues in her life. She is a victim of adultery now. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. You've resulted in another man then being guilty of adultery. So this is not a small matter at all. So the other school of thought during this time, major school of thought, was the school of Shammai. And they held the position that Deuteronomy 24 indicates that a man can divorce his wife only for the cause of sexual immorality. Jesus seems to line up with that minority opinion at this time. There was another path I wanted to take, and it just popped out of my mind. But I will get there in just a moment. The Pharisees, it's obvious from going to Matthew 19. Let's go ahead and turn over to Matthew 19. It's obvious that the Pharisees were not really interested so much in the moral principle of this question, of what Deuteronomy 24 means. Matthew 19, verse 3 says, some Pharisees came to him, testing him, and saying, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause at all? So what's the question? Is it legal? According to the Torah, is it legal? That's what the Pharisees were concerned about. For a man to divorce his wife for any cause at all. Make up any cause. Is that legal? The Pharisees were always, Paul Earnhardt says this so much better than I can. And he says this about the Pharisees. Their obsession with legal niceties to the complete disregard of moral principle is again revealed. The Pharisees viewed divorce as a right and saw the words of Moses as a command rather than a permissive allowance. By doing so, they had wholly misapprehended the law and its purpose. God's attitude toward divorce has been made abundantly clear throughout the Old Testament. And the Old Testament canon is virtually closed with the ringing words, for the Lord God of Israel says that he hates divorce. And so, Deuteronomy 24, he goes on to say, was intended to put a check on already rampant divorce, not to introduce it or to encourage it. Jesus describes the teaching of the law of divorce as a concession to Israel's hardness of heart. And so here we are again. We find ourselves at the heart of the matter. Just as murder has its fountain spring in the heart, and adultery has its origin in the heart, divorce has its problems beginning in the heart. And so Moses was given this concession, Jesus says, because of the hardness of their hearts. Let's go ahead and read this entire passage here in Matthew 19. The Pharisees weren't interested in doing anything except to trip Jesus up. And this is kind of like a politician standing in front of an audience and fielding questions. And somebody's going to, of course, put a question out there that is going to put him in a bad position. However, he answers it. Okay? And so the Pharisees' intention here with this question was to, at least, to divide Jesus' followers. This was such a controversy of this day that his followers would be divided over this. And so they're going to put Jesus in a camp. They're going to put him in a category here where it's going to reduce his influence. Or maybe even worse. Maybe they can get Jesus to go so far and have the same consequence that John the Baptizer had when he talked about divorce. When he got serious in the restrictions of the day with the kings of that day, with Herod in particular. And so Jesus deflects, like a good politician does initially. What does he do? He answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Consequently, they're no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. Jesus always does this too, doesn't he? Let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to the original intent of God's instruction about this. And he goes back to this remarkable, it's been described as a poem in Genesis, the first chapter, verse 27, where, and it sounds like a poem even in English. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. It's like a little piece of poetry right there. It's a beautiful thing. And I want you to notice the pronouns in that. It's really interesting. So God created man, and I don't think that he's saying God created Adam or a male. He's creating humanity. God created humanity in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. He uses that masculine pronoun of him to describe humanity. Because when God created humanity, he created male and female. That is the wholeness, the completeness, the perfection of humanity. And he goes on to then specify male and female, he created them. That's that plural pronoun now. So it's a beautiful play on words there that Jesus references here in this poem and said, this is how God did this. In the beginning, he made humanity. And humanity was not whole and complete until there was male and female, co-equal partners. How do I know they were co-equal? Well, verse 28 says, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over everything that moves on the earth. Who's going to do the ruling there? Humanity, male and female, are to rule. And if you turn over a couple of pages, the perfection of the Garden of Eden is broken with sin. And what does God say to the female? He says, I will put enmity between, he says that to the serpent, between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. To the woman, he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Now there appears to be this inequity that he describes as a curse upon the woman. And from that moment, that co-equal partner concept seems to be lost to humanity, even through the days of Moses. Did Moses give any instructions about the woman who was going to divorce her husband? None. Does that mean a woman is not permitted to divorce her husband? Did Moses intend for this to be a complete description of all of the rules about divorce? Steve, when you get up, that tells me that I don't have much time left.
You're done.
Let me just not be done. Let me just say just a couple more things, and then we'll be done. I wanted to get here and say this. You read these passages from Deuteronomy 24 to Matthew 5 to Matthew 19 to 1 Corinthians 7, and you come away from it with an idea that we don't have all that we need to give us full instruction about these principles. I come away with that feeling. There's nothing at all said about a woman divorcing her husband. So I can't look at this and these scriptures as a complete rule book for divorce. A comprehensive set of guidelines by which we can point to a scripture and say this or that. That is not the intent of what Jesus is doing as he's describing the law. What he is doing, he is affirming women, and he is protecting vulnerable women, and he is protecting the ideal that God established at the beginning. And his point is covenant loyalty needs to be honored among God's people. And I'll finish with one more sentence that I've said before. Relationship with God is completely intertwined with our relationships with one another. That's the point. Relationships. All right. Thank you. Thank you for your good attention and comments today.